How do the Hollywood movies and the theaters who exhibit them make their money? Now, if you've bought a $15 ticket recently to go to a premium large format screen to watch, say, Top Gun Maverick, or maybe Thor Love and Thunder, perhaps you've been wondering where that $15 goes. Are the old rumors and wives' tales out there that have been around for years that the theaters have to cough up 70, 80, 90% of that ticket sale back to the Hollywood studios like Paramount and Walt Disney actually true? Or is there something else? Is there some real numbers that we can look at to gauge? If you've watched any of the videos here on Valiant Renegade where we talk about the box office, you know the numbers are quite a bit less. But the question becomes, where do those numbers come from? Well, today, we're going to go deeper down the rabbit hole than I ever have here before in a video on this channel, because I think there is still a lot of confusion and misunderstanding out there, and there are far too many other sources out there that are still doing a lot of guesswork. But the numbers that we use here are the actual numbers, and today, for the first time, I'm going to show you the very source of where they come from. So stay tuned. Let's get into it. Online. Well, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many folks out there watching this video that are not yet subscribed, please take a moment, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and of course, do leave a comment before you head out the door today. I have a feeling this is going to be a video that hopefully, like Top Gun Maverick, will grow some legs. Hopefully, thanks to a lot of folks watching this video who will indeed share it. I think this is something that's going to be very educational that I hope a lot of folks really enjoy, because I keep seeing this discussion pop up time and time again. Every time I release a box office video out there, which is typically about once a week, talking about what's going on this weekend or last weekend and what the hauls were and how good or poorly a movie is performing relative to its production and marketing budget, what the chances are that a movie will break even or make a profit at the box office. All of that oftentimes seems to engender quite the response in the comment section of the video. And some folks just, who like movies don't like me talking about the fact that, well, it doesn't matter if you like the movie or not, or how well or what kind of record or whatever a movie broke on its opening weekend, biggest opening weekend ever of Groundhog Day or something like that. It really doesn't matter. It bears no effect whatsoever on whether or not, in and of itself at least, of whether or not a movie is going to become profitable at the box office. And a lot of that is determined by what's called rentals. And that is the figure or the factor that movie theater exhibitioners like AMC, Regal Cinemark, Marcus Theaters, or IMAX, so on and so forth, who will base their contracts upon their expectations of a movie's performance to determine what type of payout that they will return from the ticket sales back to the movie studio distributors. There have been a plethora of myths out there over the years, with some people thinking that 90% of the ticket purchase price that somebody pays to go see a film is going to be returned to a studio, and that theaters have to live off of popcorn and Twizzlers. That's simply not true. What we know factually, for example, is that ticket revenues are the highest source of net income. That means after they pay rental fees and exhibition costs back to the distributors, that those ticket sales, the shares the theaters keep, are the largest source of dollar income for any theater out there. Now, granted, their profit margins on those are not as high as, say, a bucket of popcorn or a bag of Twizzlers. However, those revenues, dollar for dollar, are much lower than what they keep from ticket sales. And today, I want to go through some of this information, because if you've been watching Valiant Renegade here long enough, you know that when we talk about box office and profitability of a film, there have been, at least recently, two figures that we use. One is a domestic figure of 55%, and the second is an international ex-China, meaning not including Chinese box office, which is dwindling these days for U.S. markets, of 43%. In other words, we keep using the figures and we keep reporting the figures that a movie studio will receive roughly 55% of the box office back for its domestic, that's United States and Canada, box office haul. And they will receive back on average roughly 43% of the international markets, not including China. China, from what we know, returns about 20 to 25% of their gross box offices back to the US studios. But a lot of folks keep wondering, where do these numbers come from? Or am I just making them up? And that I'm inventing anything that I want to make the numbers work in favor of me saying that a movie did great or a movie did poorly. No, that's not at all it. We're always into the math and the science here on this channel at Valiant Renegade. And like I said before, our motto is putting Hollywood through the business and financial lens of reality. Well, I think it's high time we start talking about what that reality is and what the source of it is when it comes to the numbers of 55 and 43% for the box office. Those numbers do change quite frequently from year to year, depending on the performance overall of the box office and how the movies are being released. And we've seen a lot of changes in the last couple of years, with more movies going to streaming much more quickly than they had in previous years before the pandemic. What this boils down to is that we have a constantly moving target from year to year. And the two largest factors that impact what the rental agreements would be for any given Hollywood new release are, number one, what is the expectation of box office returns? A figure that is usually agreed upon between both the exhibitioner and the Hollywood distributor. So say, for example, AMC and Paramount would come to an agreement on what they felt like Top Gun Maverick would perform at and would arrive at least a base level rate of rental for that film as a percentage of box office sales. Of course, the second factor is how long the theaters have exclusivity to that new release. Meaning, if you're going to drop a movie into a theater, a new release, a never-before-seen film into a theater, and give it a 4-month free run or a 6-month free run in theaters before it winds up on, say, physical media or a streaming service or maybe on a premium cable channel, then it's going to get a much higher rate of payout from the cinema, a much higher rate of rental commission, if you will, than a movie that is going to go day and date release onto a proprietary streaming service. Think of what Warner Brothers did all through 2021. Think of what Disney did in 2021 with a shortened 45-day window, which they have since continued into 2022, along with many other film studios and film distributors. All of these things have a direct impact on what a theater like AMC, Cinemark, Regal, IMAX, and Marcus, and so on, as we keep saying, all of this has an impact on what they are willing to pay out based on the ticket sales back to that distributor. And that is something that I cannot overstate enough. The question becomes, how can we then determine where these numbers come from? How can we figure out year to year what the average box office new release is taking home to the distributor and studio? Now, the best thing to do is to look at the largest sample size possible with actual financial data that breaks down exactly those figures. For that, we have this. This is the 2019 AMC Entertainment Holdings Form 10-K on file with the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is an annual report that every publicly traded company in the United States has to file by law with the SEC. And in this 175-page amount of bedlam lies all of the legal and financial data that one could hope for a company to release about what they did over the course of a year. And in this document, and the document that AMC produces each and every year just like it, it tells us how much money they took in terms of box office admissions and how much money they paid out in rentals. So here's a copy of the cover page of the December 31st, 2019 year-end report for AMC Entertainment Holdings, the largest theatrical film exhibition company in the U.S. with branches out in many international markets. So I want to read from some of the primer of this report to give you some detailed information on how AMC works and what represents the largest sources of revenue for a company like this. Box office admissions are our largest source of revenue. We predominantly licensed, quote, first-run films from distributors owned by major film production companies and from independent distributors on a film-by-film and theater-by-theater basis. Film exhibition costs are accrued based on the applicable admissions revenues and the estimates of final settlements pursuant to our film licenses. These licenses typically state that rental fees are based on aggregate terms established prior to the opening of the picture. In certain circumstances, and less frequently, our rental fees are based on mutually agreed settlement upon the conclusion of the picture. In other words, most movies that are commissioned by places like AMC, Regal, and Cinemark to be put into theaters to have first-run exclusive viewings of these movies, like most recently, things like Thor, Love and Thunder, or Top Gun Maverick, they agree up front with studios and distributors like Disney and Paramount on their expectations of box office performance and at what rate of rental or percentage of the box office they will come to for a theater to pay back to the film distributor. In less frequent cases, when there is more obscurity and lack of expectations for a film's final haul at the box office, a company like AMC or Regal Cinemark will engage in a settlement-type contract where once the picture reaches the end of its run and they see how much money a film has made, then AMC will make a settlement offer based on that run that will have to be agreed to by the distributor. During the 2019 calendar year, films licensed from our 6 largest distributors based on revenues accounted for approximately 80% of our U.S. admissions revenues, which consisted of Disney, Warner Brothers, Universal, Sony, Lionsgate, and Paramount. And for those wondering about where the largest sources of revenues come from for these types of theaters like AMC, here it is from their own report. Food and beverage sales are our second largest source of revenue after box office admissions. Now again, we're talking about gross revenue sources. We're not talking about profit margins. While indeed, as we'll show in a minute, the profit margins on a bucket of popcorn or bag of Twizzlers are much higher than those of an average movie ticket. The actual source of gross revenues, dollar for dollar on the movie tickets, much bigger than the concession stands. If math and numbers are a little bit daunting to you on financial sheets like this, fear not. That's what we're here for at Valiant Renegade, to break this down to a base level so everybody can understand what's going on. What we're looking at is page 43 of the Form 10-K on file with the Securities and Exchange Commission from AMC Entertainment Holdings. That's AMC Theaters. And what this report shows is all of the sources of revenue and expenses for the fiscal years of 2019 and 2018. And as you can see, they have it broken down by U.S. markets, international markets, and the consolidated report, which is a combination of both U.S. and international. So if we look at the first line of admissions and the number next to it, 2.388 billion, because just to remind everybody, on financial reports, as you can see here, as I've just highlighted, these figures are stated in millions. So one number with a comma followed by a second set of 3 digits and a decimal place, we're talking about the billions here. So 2.388 billion is what AMC Theaters took in 2019 for the entire fiscal year. That tells us what the total ticket sale revenue was for AMC Theaters across the board in the U.S. If we go a few lines down under operating costs and expenses, AMC graciously breaks this out as a single line item: film exhibition costs. These are the rentals that we've been talking about. This is the figure. This is the expense paid back to Hollywood studio distributors for the films that AMC has exhibited in their properties. And that figure was $1.311 billion. If we go back across the board to the international markets here under this header, same two line items, admissions, $913 million in admissions and $387.6 million in rental fees. By the way, people still wondering about Twizzlers and popcorn, look at food and beverage. If we go back to U.S. markets in that line item just under admissions, you'll see food and beverage at $1.348 billion, with a food and beverage cost under operating costs and expenses, you'll see $193.8 million. So as you can already tell without even pulling out a calculator, the profit margin on that bucket of popcorn, that Coke, that bag of Twizzlers, far, far higher than the average ticket sale. The concession stand is still a crucial part of operating for these theaters because those profit margins is what goes to pay things like salaries and rent expense and other things that the box office ticket sales alone could not by themselves cover. So that is why they're there, and that's why theaters charge as much as they do. So overall, in 2019, when several massive blockbusters came out, including Avengers Endgame, the average take-home for the Hollywood studio and distributor from AMC Theaters, the largest exhibitioner in the U.S., was about 54.9% of the domestic box office and 42.6% of the international box office. Now, many people wonder, why is the international box office so much lower than the domestic US and Canada box office? And it's a very simple issue of a far different tax and regulatory environment across 50, 60 plus different international markets, meaning that studios aren't able to just distribute those films as easily or as cost effectively as they are here in the United States. You have international distributors and third parties you have to go to. You have regulatory environments like theaters have to retain so much by law in a certain country. And other things like taxes. Think of the VAT or the value added tax that's out there in certain foreign countries. All of these things have a direct impact on the gross ticket sale prices before anything even makes it back to the theaters themselves, and then in turn makes it back to the international distributor, and then in turn makes it back to places like Disney or Paramount. All of these things have added costs. So to simply say that a movie makes 50 or 55 or 60% across the board on its global haul is simply false, because those international figures are indeed unequivocally, by the numbers, far less than what they are in the United States. But of course, things changed in the last couple of years. And this kind of data I have all the way back to 2015. And before we get into the more recent years, let's talk about some of the other years before 2019, just to see how much variance there is in these rentals, both internationally and domestically. From previous AMC Theater Form 10-K filings with the SEC, we can see here more breakdowns, U.S., international, and consolidated returns. Now, these are covering years from 2015, 2016, all the way through 2017. And not to belabor the numbers again, as we just did in the previous segment, let's just cut to the chase. In 2015, the domestic return averaged 54% of the box office. Internationally, there really wasn't much there because at that time, AMC itself had not branched out into the international markets. Same thing with 2016. However, in 2016, the domestic rentals amounted to about 53.5% of the overall box office. Very little change between those 2 years. In 2017, this is when AMC really started opening up international markets. 52.5% domestically, 42.2% international rentals. In 2018, 54.2% domestic rentals and 41% international. Now, what this boils down to is a relatively small standard deviation in terms of what the overall rentals were paid back to distributors year over year. We didn't see any really wild swings. And if you go back to that previous section where we just showed the slide of the SEC report and pause, really look over some of those gross figures. They varied almost 20 to 25% over that course of time, even all the way up through 2019 where it exploded, and in 2018 and 2017 in the $3 billion range. Well, the rentals usually stayed in the same ballpark of around the low to mid 50% of rentals. This gives us a good average return of, say, a $100 million domestic box office would yield back somewhere between 52 and 54 million to the distributor, and on the international box office, it was about the same. Very little standard deviation, where we can roughly assume a $100 million international box office would yield 41 to 43 million back to the studio and film distributor. What about 2020 and 2021? Do the 55% and 43% historical metrics, at least as they were in 2019, roughly speaking, do they still hold water today? Well, of course, like I mentioned before, two of the largest factors in terms of what rentals are for a theater exhibitioner like AMC comes down to whether or not a movie is exclusive to theaters, how long it is exclusive in those theaters, and what the expected or end result of the box office performance actually is. And as we've been discussing here on Valiant Renegade for some time, we've seen a lot of changes in actual releases. They're no longer given a 120-day theatrical exclusive like they had traditionally up through 2019. Very few of them are, with exception to most recently Spider-Man No Way Home. It did not actually get a physical media release until 4 months, a full 120 days after it was released in the box office. And it was another 90 days after that until mid-July when it was released for streaming or viewing on a premium cable channel, in this case, Starz. So of course, Spider-Man No Way Home looks to have gotten a more traditional theatrical rental contract, floating in 55% or perhaps a little bit above that margin. But most of the other releases of 2021 didn't. And we know that because we now have the 2021 annual 10K report, also from AMC Theaters, clearly showing that indeed film studios and distributors were heavily penalized for going day and date release, like Warner Brothers with HBO Max in their entire 2021 slate, and even the distributors that only gave theaters 30 days or 45 days of exclusivity, like certain Universal releases or virtually every release from the Walt Disney Company in last year's time frame. Let's look at the numbers. Here's the Form 10K from December 31st, 2021, filed with the SEC just about 3 months ago at the time we're recording this. And we can go down to the same financial reporting within this 175-page report to see exactly what AMC paid out. So between the fiscal years of 2015 and 2019, pre-pandemic, when we still had a standard run of theatrical exhibition, with movies getting a 4+ month theatrical exclusive window before hitting secondary and tertiary markets, that domestic average stood for those years combined of around 53.82%. However, in 2021, the domestic average fell to 45.3% of total grosses, and the international rental average fell to 38.9%. That is a sharp decline, almost 20% in the domestic market and around 14 to 15% in the international markets from the 2019 averages. This just goes to show what I've been talking about for the last year or so here on Valiant Renegade, that theaters were in fact penalizing studios pretty heavily for going day and date or having shortened windows of 30 to 45 days. And if you don't believe that, let's look at what the AMC financial report actually states in plain language. Film exhibition costs increased 106.5 or $237.6 million during the year ended December 31st, 2021, compared to the year ended December 31st, 2020. Due to the increase in admissions revenues, partially offset by a decrease in film exhibition costs as a percentage of admission revenues. As a percentage of admission revenues, film exhibition costs were 45.3% for the year ended December 31, 2021, and 49% for the year ended December 31st, 2020. The decrease in film exhibition cost percentage is primarily due to the concentration of box office revenues in lower grossing films and library content, that is to say, content that was not a first-run release, but borrowed from existing libraries. Think of the movie theaters that play things like Jaws and Goonies and Aliens a few times during the year. That's what the library content makes up. This typically results, the library content, in lower film exhibition costs. Additionally, lower film exhibition costs were paid on films with shorter exclusive theatrical windows. Now, I want to make something very, very clear. Library content, like I just described, makes up an incredibly small percentage of the total box office grosses. We're talking about a couple of percent here. Still, even in years like 2021, the lion's share, 95% of that box office haul, is coming in from first-run new releases. So overwhelmingly, without question, those radically lower rental averages paid back to film distributors and their respective studios came from not only lower box office results than average, but it also came primarily from shortened theatrical windows, going day-and-date release on HBO Max for companies like Warner Brothers, and making shortened windows of 30 days for movies like Encanto with the Walt Disney Company, and 45-day shortened windows for Disney with everything else. And Paramount and Universal and other film distributors are certainly not excluded from that metric, but those two were the biggest ones of 2021, and they brought the averages down quite sharply. Now, just to give you a good idea of how big the deviation or the disparity was between these types of releases, this is the fourth quarter report for AMC Theaters, just the fourth quarter of 2021. And of course, what came out at the very end of the fourth quarter and racked up darn near $500 million domestically overall in the U.S., well, that was Spider-Man No Way Home. Look at the admissions revenues of AMC Theaters in the fourth quarter of 21, $464.3 million, with film exhibition costs at $229.5. That's right, the rentals going back to studios in that quarter outperformed by a wide margin the overall average of the year. The average domestic rentals in that quarter for AMC Theaters was 49.43%, a full 5% or 500 basis points higher than the overall annual average, and that can only be attributed to Spider-Man No Way Home with its 120-day theatrical exclusive release and its stellar box office performance. That's how big of an impact that traditional release with a massive blockbuster haul had on the overall numbers. Pegging down any one individual film's actual rental agreement or their net returns from the theaters back to the film distributors and studios is a very difficult task, if nigh impossible, because these films, as we've discussed, are all negotiated on a film-by-film basis with theatrical exhibitioners. There's no way to really know what a single film really brought home, because contracts like this are all typically sealed under an NDA or a non-disclosure agreement. But the overall aggregate returns from exhibitioners like AMC give us a very, very close, tight picture of what it should be. And that, of course, is based on the fact that a film might fall in a typical box office window for a first release. If you look back at 2019, the top 50 films grossed roughly $50 million or above. And those top 50 films were the top 50 out of several hundred that were released in theaters that year. And those films represented darn near 80% of the total box office. So that 54.9% figure that we talked about returning domestically in 2019 from the box office to film distributors is heavily weighted in their favor, with the exceptions of some big outliers like Avengers Endgame that may have pulled in closer to 60%. But Valiant, what about the big movies like that? Wouldn't they have pulled in 65 or 70% like we've heard from other sources or things like this? Well, no. As we've seen over the course of time, we looked at the numbers back to 2015. Those standard deviations year over year are relatively tight, all falling within a range of a couple of 2 or 3% year over year, even in the international markets. If that's not enough, how about a November 1st, 2017 article from the Wall Street Journal entitled "Disney Lays Down the Law for Theaters on Star Wars: The Last Jedi"? You see, after the $2 billion global success of Star Wars: The Force Awakens, Disney got cocky and decided to stick theaters with a 65% rental agreement in a take-it-or-leave-it scenario almost for Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Now, of course, the promise to theaters was, if you thought the $2 billion haul of The Force Awakens was great, wait till you see the return of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. This one's going to do $2.5 billion, and we want more promises on this one. Theaters, many of them, reluctantly agreed to these terms, calling it, quote, the most onerous terms they have ever had to agree to. In other words, theaters kind of let the cat out of the bag here, that a rental agreement where the first digit started with 6 was something they had never seen before. It further goes as a spate of evidence that shows that these ranges, the standard deviations from the averages of 53 to 55%, don't go all that much in one direction or the other, provided that it is, again, a first-run release with a traditionally theatrically exclusive window. Now, of course, theaters really ate it on this movie. Because, let's face it, The Last Jedi performed very poorly compared to what theaters were promised. Almost $1 billion+ less than what theaters were promised. But that's the way it goes. And the point is that I can assure you that theaters have not engaged in this same mistake since. And what I think is very simple. If I were running the business at AMC and coming up with these contract stipulations, there's very easy, very common legal practices to put into place. Things like performance triggers. For example, think of your favorite NFL or Major League Baseball player, or maybe your favorite basketball player. You know, they promise certain salaries to them, but if they overperform, if they get the team to a championship, if they score more touchdowns or goals or hit more home runs or so on and so forth, they usually get bonused. I think this is where theaters have gone at this point, and I think it's a brilliant idea. And I wouldn't be surprised at all to see some formal announcement of this from theaters over the next couple of years to say that, well, we're going to assume that your movie is going to perform at X rate, but if it overperforms, we'll pay a bonus of 1% or 2% of the grosses from that standpoint. Or if it underperforms, you're going to cough up 1 or 2%. Also, at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised to see penalty clauses like we've talked about, like not just up front where, okay, Disney is going to tell AMC Theaters that this is going on to Disney Plus in 45 days. Disney has kind of pulled back from that in the last couple of movies. They're not pre-announcing these Disney Plus releases anymore. But if you notice, usually around the 30-day mark, they pull that cat out of the bag. And I think that's because they're putting this in the contracts. In other words, they're telling theaters, well, if we leave it in here and we have a good enough run and we reach X amount of performance, then we're going to leave it in the theaters and we're going to get the original terms of the contract, say 50%. However, Disney has an option, or Warner Brothers or Universal or Paramount has an option that they can exercise within the exhibition contract with companies like AMC and Cinemark, to where if they feel like, well, the movie fell apart after the first week, like most of the Marvel movies are doing right now. Like Lightyear, well, Lightyear fell apart in the first week, fell apart on the first day. The point is that Disney can then back out of that contract with a clause stipulation saying, okay, if it doesn't do this, we're going to move it to Disney Plus after 45 days. In return, companies like AMC and Regal Cinemark will then strike Disney with a penalty against the rental agreement. So, hey, we agreed in principle that we would pay you 50% of the box offices, for example, but if you decide to pull this movie and exercise the clause and move it to Disney Plus on day 45 or day 46, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to pull back that 50% rental agreement, and we're only going to pay you 45 or 40, for example. That's kind of where things are right now. That's what the numbers seem to very, very strongly suggest. So the bottom line is this. The traditional metrics of 53 to 55% domestic and maybe 41 to 43% international, while they have worked for a great number of years, don't appear as though they're really working nowadays with the changes in the way that film studios and their related distributors are releasing these films. These shortened windows where movies are dropping very quickly onto proprietary streaming services of these studios and distributors are indeed having a seriously negative impact, without question, on their box office rental agreements. And these declines are very sharp. And I don't feel like in the long run that this is a financially viable system. We're going to have to get back to a more traditional window. And this is why companies, studios, film distributors like Sony Pictures, for example, with Spider-Man No Way Home, are showing the way. This is why more recent films like Top Gun Maverick, where Tom Cruise had compelled Paramount into a 120-day theatrically exclusive window for the film, are showing you this is how it's done. Movie studios and film distributors can still have a very healthy and prosperous long life with their proprietary streaming services, but they should not be doing it at the expense of the theatrical windows where the real money is made. It's good to see everybody out there. Please like, please subscribe, please share this sucker out on social medias, and do leave a comment before you head out the door today. It's good to see everybody, and until next time, from Valiant Renegade, take care, y'all.